It was a bright, sunny morning when the tourist arrived in the historic city. Everything about the place seemed magical to him. The old cobblestone streets, the grand architecture, and the beautiful centuries-old monuments all seemed like scenes straight out of a history book. He had always dreamed of visiting this city, and now he was finally here. His heart raced with excitement as he took in the sights around him. As he strolled along the bustling streets, he couldn't help but admire the way the locals moved through their day. They were so at ease, so accustomed to the beauty of the place, while to him, every corner seemed like a new discovery. He wandered for hours, snapping pictures of everything he saw. Statues, fountains, and the impressive city gates. All of it felt like it belonged to a story of royalty and ancient traditions. Then he reached the town square, and his eyes immediately went to the famous royal monument standing tall in the middle. It was a symbol of the city's proud past, a place where many tourists came to take pictures. But what caught his attention even more were the royal guards stationed nearby. Their sharp uniforms, the tall plumes on their helmets, and their serious expressions made them seem like they had stepped out of history itself. The tourist had heard about these guards. They were part of a tradition that had been passed down for generations. Every day, without fail, they stood in place, keeping watch. It was said that they were incredibly disciplined and that no one dared to cross their path. But to the tourist, they seemed like living statues, perfectly still and almost untouchable. He admired them from a distance, marveling at their stoic composure. Curiosity began to rise within him. He had read stories about these guards, about how they would never break their gaze, how they remained still in any weather, no matter how hot or cold. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to see up close what it was like to be so disciplined. His mind raced with thoughts of getting a perfect picture, one that would impress his friends back home. Without thinking, he stepped a little closer, carefully making his way around the crowd. He was so caught up in his thoughts and the idea of a perfect shot that he failed to notice the line, the invisible boundary that separated the tourists from the guards. To the guards, that line was everything. It was a sign of respect, a rule that could not be ignored. As he moved closer, the guard station nearest to him shifted ever so slightly, just enough for the tourist to notice. But instead of stopping, the tourist pushed on, inching his way nearer. He could feel the thrill building inside him, the excitement of being so close to something so rare. He was close enough now to capture a clear shot of the guard's face, the intensity of his eyes, the calm yet commanding presence he held. But what the tourist didn't realize was that his curiosity was about to lead him into a situation far more intense than he could have ever imagined. The royal guard stood tall, his posture perfectly straight, as he watched the busy square. His uniform gleamed in the sunlight, its deep red and gold trim sparkling with every move he made. He had been standing there for hours, unmoving, watching over the monument and ensuring that everything remained peaceful. To the people around him, he was simply a part of the scenery, a fixture of the city's historical charm. But to him, this was no ordinary duty. It was a life's commitment. He had been trained for this job since he was young. The traditions of his family, the discipline passed down through generations, were all now a part of him. Every day, he stood in this same spot, unwavering and focused. The training had taught him to be patient, to endure long hours without complaint, and to always remain alert. There was no room for error in his role, no matter how mundane or routine it seemed to the outside world. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened. Even though his feet were sore and his body longed for a rest, he never let his attention waver. The royal guard was not just about standing still, it was about watching everything with keen eyes, noticing the smallest of details. Every person who walked by, every car that passed, every sound in the distance, he noticed them all. It was his duty to protect, to serve, and to keep the peace. As he stood at attention, his thoughts occasionally drifted to the horse waiting nearby. The animal stood just a few feet away, perfectly trained, perfectly calm. He trusted the horse as an extension of himself. They had been through many moments together, learning to work as one. The bond between a guard and his horse was not to be underestimated. The horse was his partner in everything. Together, they made a team, and each understood the other's movements without words. Despite the calm nature of the moment, the guard was always aware of the danger that could emerge in a split second. It was his job to stop any threats before they could cause harm, whether it was a curious tourist or something more serious. His role was simple on the outside but incredibly important in maintaining the royal traditions and keeping the peace in such a public place. The guard's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, scanning the crowd. He had seen many tourists over the years, many of them taking pictures or trying to get closer to him. Some were respectful, keeping a safe distance, but others were more daring, stepping over the invisible line that separated them from the guard's space. He had learned to deal with all types, ignoring the attention, staying focused on the job at hand. But today, something felt different. His eyes caught a movement in the crowd. A tourist, someone stepping closer than he should have. The guard's attention sharpened immediately. He had seen this before, people crossing boundaries without realizing the consequences. The tourist was moving toward him, clearly excited about getting a good picture, unaware of the invisible line he was about to cross. As the tourist edged closer, the guard's instincts kicked in. He straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath, preparing himself for what could come next. He knew the situation needed to be handled with care, calmly, swiftly, and without hesitation. The horse, sensing his change in posture, also stood a little taller, ready to react as well. It was a quiet, tense moment as the guard continued to observe the tourist. Little did the tourist know, he was about to make a decision that would alter his day in a way he couldn't possibly have imagined. The tourist, completely focused on getting his perfect photo, was unaware of the tension building around him. His excitement had clouded his judgment, and he took another step forward, inching closer to the royal guard. He could barely contain his enthusiasm. He had seen the royal guards in pictures and movies before, but now, here he was, standing just a few feet away from one of them. It felt unreal. He raised his camera, carefully framing the shot. The guard's stern expression, his polished uniform, and the grandeur of the monument behind him were the perfect backdrop for a once-in-a-lifetime picture. The tourist's hands were steady, his eyes locked on the guard, but as he prepared to take the photo, something strange happened. The guard's gaze shifted toward him. It wasn't an obvious movement, just a slight shift of his eyes, but it was enough to send a ripple of realization through the tourist. For the first time, he became aware of the seriousness in the guard's eyes. There was no smile, no warmth in his expression, just a calm, unwavering focus. The tourist felt a small knot form in his stomach. He hesitated for a moment but quickly brushed it off, thinking it was just a look of professionalism. After all, this was part of the royal tradition, right? But as the tourist continued moving forward, he felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just the heat of the day. There was an unmistakable change. The guard's body had tensed slightly, and the tourist instinctively felt that something was wrong. He wasn't sure what it was, but a small voice inside him told him to stop. But curiosity pushed him forward. His excitement was too strong to ignore. He took another step closer, the camera still raised, his focus entirely on the shot. He was so close now that he could almost touch the guard's uniform. The horse, standing silently beside the guard, shifted its weight, its ears flicking back as it sensed the approaching figure. The tourist paid no mind, lost in his pursuit of the perfect photo. He was completely unaware that the guard had taken a deep breath, his posture becoming even more rigid. The warning signs had been there, the guard's shift in stance, the horse's subtle reaction, but the tourist didn't see them. He was too caught up in his own excitement. With one last step, the tourist crossed an invisible line. The personal space of the guard and his horse was sacred. It was a boundary that no one, especially not a tourist, should cross. And yet, The tourist had done just that. He was now standing just inches from the horse, his camera ready to capture the moment. The moment was electric. The tourist felt a rush of adrenaline. He could see the details of the Royal Guard's uniform now, the intricate stitching, the gleaming buttons, the polished boots. Everything seemed perfect, and he smiled to himself, proud of his bravery. He had done what others might have been too nervous to attempt. But in that instant, as the camera clicked and the tourist smiled with pride, the guard's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, and there was no mistaking its authority. The warning had been issued. It was too late now for the tourist to realize the consequences of his actions. He had crossed a line that could not be undone. The tourist was still oblivious to the growing tension around him. He was too focused on his camera, capturing the Royal Guard and his horse in perfect detail. The image in his lens was flawless. He didn't realize that he was pushing his luck by standing so close to the guard and his horse. The environment around him, which had seemed so calm and relaxed just moments ago, was now filled with a subtle but undeniable energy. As the tourists zoomed in for a closer shot, the horse's ears flicked back. The movement was so small, so delicate, but it was enough to catch the guard's attention. The horse, a well-trained and calm animal, was growing uneasy. Its eyes were locked on the tourist, and the slight shift in its body was a warning sign, one that the tourist still didn't pick up on. The horse could sense danger, even when it wasn't obvious to humans. The guard's grip on the reins tightened slightly. He remained motionless, still as a statue, but his senses were alert. The horse's discomfort was enough to make him take note of the situation. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, scanning the tourist's every movement. His training had taught him how to handle such situations, how to react quickly if someone overstepped their boundaries. But despite his calm demeanor, he was fully aware of the potential for things to go wrong. He had seen tourists like this before, those who didn't respect the space between the guards and their horses. Some took pictures, some tried to get too close, but they all made the same mistake. They assumed the guards were untouchable, that nothing could ever go wrong. What they didn't understand was that the horses were not just part of the display. They were living beings, just as sensitive and unpredictable as any human. The guard's job was not only to protect the monument and uphold the royal tradition, it was to ensure that everyone around him remained safe. But the tourist was unaware of the danger he was walking into. His smile widened as he raised his camera for yet another shot. The closer he got, the more the horse shifted, its muscles tensing with every step the tourist took. The guard, however, remained stoic, his posture as still as ever, not betraying any hint of the pressure building inside him. At this moment, the guard knew that he had to act, but he also knew that it had to be done swiftly. He couldn't afford to let the situation escalate. His training kicked in. In a fraction of a second, he made his decision. Without warning, he took a step forward, using his body to guide the horse back just enough to create space between the animal and the tourist. The movement was precise and quick, an instinctual action born from years of training. The tourist, still smiling and unaware, continued to inch closer, oblivious to the guard's silent warning. The space between them was shrinking, and in that moment, the guard could see the potential for the situation to spiral out of control. His heart raced for a moment. He knew what had to be done. The tourist had crossed the line, and now it was time to make him understand. In a flash, the Royal Guard acted. His training, honed through years of discipline, kicked in without a moment's hesitation. He moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this exact scenario countless times. With a swift motion, he placed his hand on the horse's reins, giving a gentle but firm tug to guide the animal back. The horse, sensing the shift in energy, took a step back. The guard's posture was still, yet every movement he made was purposeful. He was sending a clear message, but it was one that the tourist would only realize too late. The tourist, caught up in the excitement of his photo opportunity, didn't see it coming. He was so focused on his camera, trying to capture the perfect shot, that he failed to notice the subtle changes around him. The guard's sudden movement, the horse's shift, and the quick glance of warning from the guard, all went unnoticed by the tourist, who was now standing directly in the path of the royal guard's horse. The guard's hand moved decisively, reaching out toward the tourist. It wasn't a violent gesture, but one born from a deep sense of duty. With a firm yet controlled motion, he made contact with the tourist's shoulder, gently but firmly pushing him away from the horse's face. The blow, though not intended to harm, was enough to send the tourist stumbling backward. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The tourist's eyes widened in shock as he tried to steady himself. He hadn't expected this. He had never imagined that his innocent attempt to get closer to the royal guard would lead to something like this. His heart raced as the guard's cold, unwavering gaze met his. The force of the push wasn't painful, but it was powerful enough to make him realize that he had crossed a line he should never have approached. The tourist staggered a few steps back, his camera dropping from his hands in the chaos of the moment. He looked up at the guard, stunned and disoriented, trying to understand what had just happened. The guard stood perfectly still, his posture unchanged, as if nothing had occurred. His role was clear: to maintain order, to protect, and to ensure that no one, not even a curious tourist, disturbed the delicate balance of the royal duties he upheld. The onlookers around them began to murmur, some with surprise, others with quiet amusement at the situation. A few tourists whispered among themselves, unsure whether to laugh or to feel sympathy for the embarrassed stranger. The guard, however, remained unfazed, his expression unchanged. To him, this was just another part of his duty. He had no time for emotion or reaction. His responsibility was clear: to stop any disruption before it could escalate. The tourist, now realizing the seriousness of what had just occurred, stood still for a moment, trying to regain his bearings. His pride was bruised, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of embarrassment. He had been foolish to ignore the boundaries that were so clearly set by the guard and his horse. He had thought it was all part of a performance, a show to be admired. But now he saw it for what it truly was: an important duty that demanded respect. With a quick glance at the guard, the tourist understood. There was no room for mistakes here. The guard had acted not out of anger, but out of necessity. The message was clear: respect the boundaries, respect the traditions, and never take for granted the presence of those who serve. The tourist stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced as he struggled to regain his composure. He had never imagined that something as simple as wanting a closer look at a royal guard would lead to a situation like this. As he looked back at the guard, his face was a mix of confusion and embarrassment. He felt his face flush as the reality of the situation sank in. The guard, standing tall and unyielding, didn't flinch. His expression remained as stoic and unreadable as it had been from the beginning. There was no anger in his eyes, no frustration. He simply stood there, a silent figure of authority. To the guard, this was just another moment in a day filled with similar encounters. He had seen it all before: tourists who got too close, unaware of the line they were crossing. His role was clear: to protect, to maintain order, and to ensure that the sacred space around the royal guards remained undisturbed. The tourists around them had started to notice the commotion. Some whispered among themselves, while others seemed more amused by the scene. A few people even gave the tourists sympathetic looks, as if they understood how easily someone could make such a mistake. But the tourist couldn't bring himself to look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his hands trembling slightly as he bent down to pick up his camera. He could feel the eyes of others on him, and the weight of his mistake made his stomach churn. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. Some people, watching from a distance, exchanged knowing glances. They had seen similar situations before. Tourists who didn't understand the seriousness of the royal guard's duties, who assumed that their presence was just for show. But they quickly learned that this was no ordinary spectacle. The guards were there to do more than look impressive. They were there to protect, to serve, and to uphold centuries of tradition. The boundaries they set were not just rules. They were vital to maintaining order in a place steeped in history. The tourist, now standing awkwardly, tried to piece together his thoughts. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant to cause any trouble, but he knew that the moment had passed. There was nothing he could say that would undo the mistake he had made. He had crossed a line that, in this context, was not meant to be crossed. In a way, the guard's swift reaction had taught him a valuable lesson, one he wouldn't soon forget. As he slowly backed away, still feeling the weight of the moment, he glanced once more at the guard. For a brief second, their eyes met. The guard's expression hadn't changed, but there was something in his gaze that the tourist couldn't quite place. It wasn't judgment, nor was it indifference. It was simply the gaze of someone who had seen it all before, a professional, doing his job without a second thought. The tourist couldn't help but feel a wave of respect for the guard, despite the way things had unfolded. The guard had done what was necessary, with no anger, no words, just action. The horse, too, seemed calm once more, standing patiently beside the guard as if nothing had happened. It was as though the entire incident had been nothing more than a brief interruption in the flow of the day, a reminder that even the most simple of actions could have consequences. With a final glance, the tourist turned and walked away. He felt a mix of relief and embarrassment, but above all, he felt a newfound understanding. He had learned something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life: respect for boundaries, respect for traditions, and the understanding that not everything was a show for his enjoyment. Some things were meant to be honored, not disturbed. As the tourist walked away, his steps were slow and heavy, each one filled with the weight of his mistake. He couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in his head. He had come to the city excited to experience its history, its culture, and its traditions. But what he had found was a lesson in respect, one he had never anticipated. His eyes kept drifting back to the royal guard, who remained perfectly still. The guard's composure was unshaken, his posture as dignified and professional as ever. It struck the tourists just how much control the guard had over the situation, how effortlessly he had restored order without so much as a word. The tourist couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for the guard's calm, unwavering presence. It wasn't just his training that made him effective. It was his ability to stay focused and maintain control in moments when others might have faltered. The horse, too, had been a picture of grace under pressure. It had been startled for a brief moment, but it had quickly regained its calm, standing firm beside the guard. It was as though the animal had known exactly how to respond to the situation, just like its handler. The partnership between the guard and the horse was clear, a bond forged through years of training and trust. As the tourist continued walking, he began to notice the reactions of the people around him. Some were still whispering among themselves, likely discussing the incident. He could hear a few chuckles from some of the nearby tourists who had witnessed what had just happened. They didn't mean any harm by it. It was just a part of the spectacle of visiting a city so rich in history. But the tourist wasn't laughing. He had learned the importance of understanding the boundaries that existed in this space and how quickly things could change when those boundaries were ignored. As he made his way through the square, he couldn't help but feel the stares of some of the other visitors. He wondered if they, too, had seen what had happened. Some might have felt sorry for him, but others might have just seen him as another tourist who didn't know the rules. To them, he was just a fleeting figure in a busy day, someone who had gotten a little too close to something he didn't fully understand. But for him, the moment would stay with him long after he left the city. It had been a humbling experience, one that reminded him how easily things could go wrong, even in the most seemingly simple of moments. The lesson was clear. He had been foolish, but he had also learned something valuable. Respect for the traditions and roles of others wasn't just important, it was essential. The royal guards, the monument, the whole ceremony, these weren't just for show. They represented a long history of service, discipline, and respect. And the guard, in his calm yet firm response, had reminded the tourist that some things were not to be taken lightly. As he left the square, the tourist took one last look back. The guard was still there, unmoving, like a silent sentinel keeping watch over the history and traditions of the city. The tourist felt a strange sense of gratitude. It was a simple act, but it had taught him something profound. He had learned that the world was full of invisible lines, boundaries that needed to be respected, even if they weren't always obvious. And now he understood that sometimes it was best to step back, observe, and appreciate the beauty around you, without crossing into spaces where you didn't belong. The tourist's footsteps grew quieter as he walked further away from the Royal Guard and the monument, his mind still processing the events that had just unfolded. As he walked, he reflected on how one small mistake had completely shifted his perspective on the day. What had started as a carefree exploration of a new city had quickly become a lesson in respect, one he wasn't likely to forget anytime soon. He looked around at the other tourists in the square. Many of them seemed to be going about their day, snapping photos, chatting with friends, and admiring the surroundings. To them, it was just another day in a place full of history. But for the tourist, everything had changed. He now saw the guards not as just a part of the city's charm, but as individuals with a deep responsibility. Their role was more than just standing still or looking impressive. It was about maintaining the balance and respect that the city's traditions demanded. He realized just how little he had understood about the significance of the Royal Guards until that moment. They weren't simply performing for the tourists. They were fulfilling a duty that had been passed down through generations. And while most tourists would walk by without a second thought, the guard had been aware of everything around him, staying alert and ready to act when necessary. The tourist now saw the guard not just as a symbol, but as a protector of something much bigger than himself. The tourist couldn't help but chuckle at his own naivety. He had thought that the Royal Guards were simply part of the experience, something to admire from afar. But today, he had learned that there were boundaries even in the most seemingly harmless situations. The invisible line he had crossed was more than just a physical boundary. It was a line of respect for the traditions and roles of those who served. As he neared the edge of the square, the tourist noticed a family of tourists taking photos near the monument. They were laughing and enjoying the moment, much like he had been earlier. But now, as he watched them, he couldn't help but wonder if they truly understood the importance of the guards and the space they maintained. He wasn't sure if he had the right to tell them what he had learned, but he hoped that, one day, they might come to understand it the way he had. The tourist's hand brushed against his camera, still hanging loosely by his side. He had forgotten all about the photo he had been trying to take earlier. He had no interest in it now, not because the moment wasn't beautiful, but because the lesson he had learned was far more valuable. The photo he had wanted to capture could never truly capture what had happened in that brief interaction with the guard. It wasn't about the perfect shot. It was about the respect that needed to be shown to the traditions and people who maintained that respect day after day. He stopped for a moment, taking one last look at the square. The Royal Guard was still there, standing tall and unmovable, just as he had been when the tourist had first laid eyes on him. But now, the guard didn't seem like a statue or a figure in a uniform. He seemed like a living embodiment of the city's values, silent, steady, and full of purpose. The tourist realized that the guard's duty was not just to protect the monument or the people, but to ensure that the spirit of the city remained intact. With a final glance, the tourist turned and continued on his way, feeling both humbled and grateful. He had come to the city seeking adventure, but what he had found was something far more meaningful. It wasn't the monuments or the landmarks that would stay with him. It was the lesson he had learned about respect, boundaries, and the importance of understanding the spaces we share with others. He knew he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his travels, and for the rest of his life.